Hello and welcome to the Expanse. I'm the Quack and I hope you're having a less quack day than myself. This is Ramblings of a Mad Duck. Afterlives Revendreth. So I was planning to start this talking about the cow with the Hellish Scream, but instead I'm going to start with the one scene that, similar to all the others, seems to be designed to create a massive amount of speculation and imply a lot about the overall lore of World of Warcraft. That scene in Afterlives Revendreth is this specific scene with the crystal that is empowered by anima. Why is this scene so important? Well, basically it's the crystal. What is that crystal that the Venthyr just empowered? To cut a very long story short, I think that's a blood crystal. And I mean, I know saying that in of itself is kind of like a joke, because we're dealing with the Venthyr who are based off vampires to begin with, but I'm actually dead serious. I think that's a blood crystal. Now, the reason that crystal, possibly being a blood crystal, is incredibly important is because if you played during the Burning Crusade, you've seen blood crystals before. The Blood Elves used to create and use blood crystals. And the other, more technical name for a blood crystal is actually a mana crystal. So, the implication that crystal in this animatic is giving is that mana equals anima equals spirit. And if that is the case, then I can basically say right now, all magic, and I mean all magic, regardless of whether it's order, disorder, light, shadow, life, death, all of it is powered by spirit, which for some people is going to be a no-brainer as they probably already assumed this to be the case, but the existence of these crystals in Revendreth seem to be confirmation of the concept. And the reason I'm fairly certain these crystals are blood crystals is because of the Sunwell Plateau, as in the raid. Because not only is that entire raid full of incredibly odd lore, like Kil'jaeden saying he's going to overthrow Sargeras, Caligos being possessed by a dread lord, Oblivion mages and cackles and hounds, statues that are seemingly dedicated to Elune but seem to indicate that she's a sun goddess instead. The list goes on, but overall that raid is full of very interesting little tidbits. The part of the raid that I think confirms this crystal is a blood crystal is a room just after the third boss. As in after Felmist, as you head towards the Eredar twins, you firstly have to go through these very odd looking blood elves that initially I thought were supposed to be some form of inspiration for demon hunters, but looking at them now, they seem to be very, very similar to Denathrius in their look. But regardless, they're just like a nice little addition. The real place of interest is a room you have to travel through to get to the Eredar twins. It's called the Sanguine Chamber. Inside this chamber, you find a bunch of red mana crystals. And overall, the scene that's kind of occurring makes absolutely no sense, or at least it doesn't if you assume mana isn't spirit. And, well, their coloration has something to do with the type of anima that's inside them. This room seems to imply that these crystals, these mana crystals, were created by soulbinders and light shapers by placing spirit within these crystals and using them for power, basically. Because you basically have soulbinders, who are basically warlocks, and also life shapers inside this room, seemingly gaining power from these crystals. And the joke is that the Blood Elves still use these crystals to this day. It kind of adds a bit of interesting context as to why the Blood Elves got control of the constructs inside TOT, which were powered by anima. The implication being that they kind of had an idea of what anima was because they literally use it to power their crystals. So where Blizzard did diversify the resource management for pretty much all DPS classes, especially the casters, as in changing what they use to actually cast abilities, fundamentally they all still use mana, or more precisely, fundamentally, they all use spirit. They just use spirit in different ways. And a fun little thing that I think really pushes all of this over the edge is that the Sunwell Plateau is home to one other form of crystal that has absolutely no explanation behind its existence. Those crystals are burning crystals. These crystals look like fel crystals, but instead of being the typical just solid green, instead they have a fire inside the middle of them, and some have an eye animation that basically follows you around as you look at the crystals. Now, to be 100% clear, these crystals seriously have no origin or explanation behind what they are, or whose eyes they're supposed to be. I mean, you could assume they're Kil'jaeden's, or you could assume they're Sargeras's, However, the Sunwell, as I said, has that very weird instance where Kil'jaeden basically seems to imply he's going to overthrow Sargeras if he captures the Sunwell. So I guess playing into the speculation established by Denathrius conspiracy, I think those eyes are supposed to be the jailers. Now, whether they were jailers from day one, that's up to you to decide. But considering everything within the Sunwell and everything we currently know now, I get the impression they've been given significantly more context than they had back in BC. Now, to say there are a massive amount of implications and things to explain in regards to mana equaling spirit if this crystal does turn out to be a blood crystal is ridiculous. I mean, like, the list goes on and on and on, and it basically explains / defines most of the established lore in World of Warcraft, and possibly redefines some aspects as well. But to kind of give a short list of the more important things to pay attention to, the first is, as I mentioned, all magic is based off the same principle and powered by the same thing: souls, spirits, which, if true, means ley lines, as in the big lines of magical energy that are used to create pocket dimensions and are described to be the literal basis of all magic in the universe, are quite literally rivers of souls, or veins of souls. Which, interestingly enough, adds some very interesting context as to why I think the mobs in the Maw are called Stingier mobs, or there are some Stingier mobs in the Maw, because Stingier, IRL, is quite specifically related to the River Styx. So it's quite possible when you see a ley line, you're quite literally looking at the River Styx in World of Warcraft, or something akin to it. And yeah, this leads on to the Maw. The Maw, for all intents and purposes, seems to be either the end of the line for all ley lines, in which case, just wow, that's incredibly important, or it's quite specifically the end of one ley line, which would generally imply that the physical universe and possibly other universes or dimensions have one specific ley line related to their dead, which kind of acts as a cycle for that universe. Or at least that might be the case. But anyway, this would also imply that the Shadowlands is within a ley line, and is basically saturated by ley line energies, with the intention generally being to be as close to the ley line energies themselves, like in their most purest form, without losing your form. Or at least I figured that would be the case, and that would explain how the Shadowlands is kind of a realm of anima. This possible revelation about all magics being related to one specific source of power also creates another option for the Maw that I honestly didn't think of, but reminds me of a very old theory and gives a very interesting explanation behind the Maw and its purpose. What I mean by that is, overall my assumption of the Maw has been that it's kind of like the end of the road, the darkness outside of the cycle. If you go to the Maw, if things get into the Maw, we're all screwed, blah 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 blah. If the Maw is, however, the end of the road for all spirit, all magic, then there's actually a very real possibility that it's actually supposed to be within the cycle, and its purpose within the cycle is supposed to be, well, basically a hard reset. If you've been around the channel from the start, and I mean like the very, very start, you might remember the term universal blood, or universal blood theory. If you haven't, don't worry. Basically, the third theory I ever put out was called Azerite Explained Part 1 and 2. The first part basically goes on this whole escapade about how Deathwing seemingly wanted to create Azerite, or at least artificial Azerite, and the closest thing he got to doing so was the Dragon Soul. And there's also the possibility that the byproduct of said experiments was Elementium, and that the Cataclysm was an attempt to get Azerite out of the ground, etc, etc. That's part 1. In part 2, I go into this rather obscure theory about the idea of how all the magics of World of Warcraft can kind of be analogized to the parts of blood. And so the idea was that you could say the elements were plasma, you could say blood cells were magic, and then you'd say DNA is spirit. And for those who know their biology, and particularly blood, I know the analogy is cringe in comparison to the actual technicalities that surround blood. But regardless, what's interesting about this possibility of all magics being powered by spirit is that in this universal blood theory, something I mentioned was the idea that spirit kind of comes in coded and uncoded forms. As I said, I basically equivocated it to DNA, and the idea that spirit could be broken down into coded and uncoded DNA. Now, if that specific part of the theory holds up, then the Maw's purpose could actually be within the cycle. And the reason why is that its purpose would be, well, basically to be a massive spirit filter. As in, the whole idea behind the Maw is to basically reset spirit. Not destroy it, but basically take whatever it's been coded into and, well, deconstruct it into an uncoded version of spirit, which I think is supposed to be white magic, so magic basically similar to Elun's. So overall, to I guess state the obvious, this would mean that the Maw is death, but it's death within the cycle, as in it's not the death of the universe, it's more the death of an individual. As in it literally takes a person and, well, erases them from existence, leaving only behind spirit to be, well, reused for the universe. Which in one regard isn't that bad, as in the universe needs something like this if it is a cycle, as in something needs to reset everything, everything needs to basically die. And if the Maw does so, acting as a massive spirit filter, well, cool, there's no problem with that. You can't really argue with the logic, it's a practical method of ensuring the cycle. There is, however, arguably one massive problem with the existence of such a system, and that is if you know you're going to die, but you also know that you're not going to kind of be rewarded for what you did in life, so you don't think you're going to go to whatever you think is a better afterlife, then I'd argue there is going to probably be one of two reactions. The first reaction is that you're still going to be a decent person and just live your life out and eventually accept your fate. However, there are others who, knowing this, who would arguably just focus on trying to become immortal, like eternally immortal no matter the cost. And when I say no matter the cost, just think about blood magic, necromancy, and all the other things you see in regards to World of Warcraft and the way people have kind of extended their lives. The most effective ways are usually the most brutal and disgusting. And so what you basically have is the very likely possibility of a universe that decides to become incredibly savage and disturbed, all in the name of trying to stop themselves from dying. So yes, it is a 50-50 toss-up, but when it comes to people trying to make themselves immortal, well, let's be real here. Those stories usually and consistently go wrong. And this is where I think a very interesting dynamic presents itself between the clockmakers, I think it was the clockmakers or clockmaker, I'm just going to go with clockmakers, between the clockmakers and the first ones. And that dynamic basically presents itself in Oribos, because Oribos quite specifically subverts the Maw. Now, it doesn't completely subvert the Maw, because spirits still go to afterlives to kind of, well, serve out their eternities or eventually be changed into something else. So they kind of go into the cycle. But at the same time, they don't go into the Maw. They basically just don't go into the reset function of the universe. The first ones seemingly created their own version with Oribos. Now, if that is the case, then that seems to imply that the possible clockmakers or whatever the hell created the Maw and the first ones did not get along in the slightest. And so they basically created their own spirit filter, which didn't involve basically breaking down every single soul in the universe. Which, in one regard, proves how powerful the first ones are, but also makes you wonder about who they actually were. Because what they basically did, at least for mortals, is give them the opportunity to create their own afterlives. Now, the fact that they could consider creating their own afterlives to begin with is kind of insane in regards to how powerful they may be. But overall, if they were dealing with people who were trying to make themselves immortal for eternity, or dealing with generations of people like growing up thinking they need to make themselves immortal, then I can kind of see why they did it. And it kind of curves an incredibly dangerous mindset that could overall and fundamentally destroy everything. And because I like putting things out there that are just incredibly quack. In regards to what the first ones may have been like, I hope this gets exposed like years from now. I genuinely do hope this, because it would be an interesting reveal to say the least. I would be very curious to know if the first ones turn out to be some form of mortal. And I know that's a statement of itself considering everything that's going on. But basically, considering they did create Oribos and basically created what mortals would consider a good afterlife in comparison to the Maw, it does make me wonder if we are walking in the footsteps of, well, kind of ourselves. Not ourselves in regards to our characters, but like in regards to other mortals who were just incredibly powerful. But anyway, that's just a fun little pseudo-theory to think about. In regards to blood crystals and this possibility of mana equaling anima equaling spirit, basically, yeah, the overall implication is all magic is based off spirit, or is powered by spirit. And there's a significant amount of stuff explained and possibilities created with such a concept being the case. Coming back to the animatic, a quick little something I wanted to look at was the troll being tortured by the Venthia. Now, there is no given name to this troll, though I do have to wonder if it's Zul'jin, as in the leader of the Armani, that kind of got, well, yeah. We killed him, he was a dick, but at the same time, his life and his people got screwed over hard. So in regards to a soul that did betray the lower, did kind of screw them over, but wasn't 100% evil, Zul'jin kind of fits the bill in regards to a troll that would have ended up in Revendreth. And so yeah, that troll may be Zul'jin. Skipping over to the cow with the Hellish Scream, I really don't have much to say about him. As in, did he deserve to go to Revendreth? Kind of. Is it quite possible he's just full of that much pride that the Venthyr have been able to drain him for so long? Yes. Should he have gone to the Maw by now, considering how long he's possibly been in Revendreth or how much pride they seem to be extracting from him? Quite possibly yes, because I'll be honest, yes, Thrall did screw him over, and yes, the Horde leadership was not kind to him in the slightest, and yes, he didn't have the best of circumstances in regards to guidance after becoming War Chief. But the fact that by the end of it all, he was still so far from repentant, and that he did not think he did anything wrong in the slightest, for me personally, is the staple of the cow with the Hellish Scream. And to change that, well, yeah, it's kind of weird. I mean, I know Anachronis mentioned that in all of the timelines we managed to get the worst Garrosh Hell Scream possible. And so yes, there is potential for him to change, but at the same time, for me personally, if he manages to get redemption, then Sylvanas, Arthas, etc., it's like, if Garrosh can get the redemption he apparently deserves in the eyes of some people, and in the eyes of others he doesn't, then those two should also at least get the chance to be redeemed, in which case Sylvanas and Arthas should be going to Revendreth. But anyway, on a personal level, do I think the cow with a Hellish Scream is getting what he deserves? Yes, 100%. The one thing I am curious about though, and maybe it's just the lighting, but Garrosh's soul doesn't look similar to the other souls in Revendreth. What I mean by that is, when you look at the troll, right, quite obviously blue, spirit, having anima extracted from him. Garrosh, on the other hand, and once again, as I said, it might just be the lighting, but Garrosh doesn't look like a spirit. And this has to make me wonder, spirits in the Shadowlands assumedly don't regenerate anima easily, or just don't regenerate anima at all. So it has to make me wonder, did the Venthyr give Garrosh some form of body to allow him to regenerate his anima more quickly so they could drain it? And so basically the reason why he's a workhorse is because, yeah, he basically has a physical body inside Revendreth. Alright, and just a few things I did forget to mention in relation to the possibility of blood crystals, everything being powered by spirit, etc., etc. If that is the case, then I can safely say that technically all spirits can regenerate anima slowly inside the Shadowlands, because basically what's happening within these zones is that the magic of the universe is like passing over them, and so the general excess and whatnot, basically how Bliss described anima being oxygen, kind of flows through the area, and so spirits will kind of, well, be more present and last forever, basically, as in they won't fade, and if anything they can become stronger. And if anything, when it comes to spirits like Garrosh's, the anima that gets close to them might get converted into whatever strong emotion they have. In the case of Garrosh, pride, and overall that might just be how it works in relation to all of the zones. And also, if the Shadowlands is on a ley line, then I am willing to say that death broke, likely because someone screwed with the ley line. In which case, what happened with Hellier kind of gets thrown out the window, but what replaces it is something that may have happened in Karazhan, as in the Legion messing around with a massive leyline nexus trying to connect Legion worlds to Azeroth, or turn the planet into a beacon as they kind of described. But this overall still leaves Gul'dan, 7.2, like Tomb of Sargeras, and 7.3 and Sargeras stabbing the sword into the planet, all very real options as to what broke death. Oh, right, and yeah, if magic or spirit is the basis for magic, then the reason why the Venthyr kind of look like withered is because they basically are withered, as in they're not your atypical withered, I mean wretched. The fellow-addicted blood elves that look like Venthyr. The reason why they look similar is because they are basically the same. The last thing I'm going to add to this part about Cow with the Hellish Scream and kind of anima extraction as a whole is that anima extraction seems to be the purification process. However, the drinking of the purified substance is completely on the Venthyr. Fundamentally, they drink that prideful anima quite willingly, which, well, when I get to the next part of this, you're going to understand why it's very interesting. But basically, the overall process creates a very smart way of ensuring they always have anima, but also, as mentioned, basically turns them into addicts to the stuff. As in, because the anima is so potent, if they stop using it, they're probably going to die and wither quite quickly. Okay, so the final thing this anime made me question was, who is Sire Denathrius? And as in, like, I know his lore, I know he made the Menthia, I know he's probably the most arrogant character we've ever met, except for maybe Ajara. But other than those things, who is he? This animatic overall had a general lack of pace in comparison to all the other animatics, and is quite obviously the shortest. And overall it just seems to focus specifically on Denathrius and his monologue. And okay, considering the revelations that are going to occur in Revendreth about who Denathrius is and what he's done, etc., it partially makes sense. But at the same time, throughout that entire monologue, something I couldn't help but notice, and just it felt like it was there on purpose, was that the monologue specifically seems to be going out of its way to mock the light, as in the general tenets of the light and the light's general notion of being a good, holy purpose. As in, he equates himself and his entire purpose and the Venthia's purpose to this holy mission where they are compassionate, fair, they help try leading creatures to redemption, they're honourable, etc., and he finally closes it by saying they have a bright future while we literally watch one of the Venthia burn. So with this thought in mind and everything else I've just mentioned about the possible revelations inside of this animatic, it got me thinking, okay, the Venthia obviously extract anima, but extracting anima seems to be the purification process, not the necessity Venthia need to live. If anything, that seems to be optional, and they've kind of become, well, withered, wretched, but basically magic addicted elves because of it. Now, they mightn't be as heavily afflicted by addiction in regards to mana because they live in the Shadowlands and it's a place of anima, so overall I could imagine the effects are significantly less than those in the physical universe. But at the same time, it's kind of this thing of, why would you drink the anima? Why wouldn't you just, well, generally just discard it in general? Why do the Venthia, in comparison to, yeah, pretty much all of the other zones, go explicitly out of their way to extract anima, then drink it? Well, if we go with the idea that, you know, spirit is the basis for all magic in the universe, or the power source for all magic in the universe, it kind of makes sense why, as in they like the idea of power. But at the same time, it also raises the other question in relation to this. What would the Venthia be like if they didn't drink anima? As in, what if they didn't drink the anima they extracted? What if they just, well, yeah, discarded it? That's when, for me, Denathrius' speech started to take on a whole different type of context. Because then, if you just go on that one assumption, as in just take away the fact they drink the anima, everything they say makes a shocking amount of sense. As in their holy mission, their idea of redeeming people, being compassionate, blah 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 blah. It actually fits everything he says. And this is where the other bit of lore in relation to Revendreth becomes rather interesting. Because we know the light has a presence in Revendreth. We don't know why it has a presence in Revendreth, however from everything I've heard, it seems as if the light is enacting some form of retribution against the Venthia and Denathrius as a whole. Which makes sense considering the light's magic doesn't necessarily destroy Venthia straight out. As in, if we look at Lothraxion, the light can seemingly convert Venthia, or at least that seems to be the case. So for the light in Revendreth to literally drive the Venthia mad means it's definitely designed to hurt them. But the question is why? Now, the likely reason why is probably because of the Naru that's located in Revendreth, as in we find out throughout the questing that the Venthia have a Naru prisoner. And this is where the enemy infiltration preface becomes very interesting in relation to how old it actually is. Because the question I'd ask is this: what if the light aspect of that enemy infiltration preface has already happened? As in, what if the Venthia / Nath regime that Denathrius sired and sent out had already infiltrated the light before Lothraxion and succeeded in their mission being to capture a Naru? Because something about the Naru and their apparent keepers that we have to remember is that all the Prime Naru are currently, well, gone. As in, Zira seemed to imply, or at least I'm pretty sure she said she was the last Prime Naru, and with her death there are no more Prime Narus left. So it would be very interesting if the Light's retribution, or at least what's left of the Light's retribution in Revendreth, was a reaction to possibly something they figured out the Venthia did. But with that possibility aside, there is another possibility that I think is significantly more possible and raises some very interesting questions about where Denathrius came from and how in the world he managed to get the position that he did. because the enemy infiltration preface mentions that the Naaru have keepers. Now, assumedly the Naaru in Revendreth had a keeper, but they're obviously gone. Now, we could assume, and rightly so, that the Venthyr / Nathrezim / whoever captured the Naaru killed the Naaru's keepers and just took the Naaru. But I have to wonder, considering everything Sire Denathrius goes through in his monologue, would he have been the keeper of that Naaru? Could he have betrayed the Naaru he was apparently supposed to be loyal to? And if you're curious as to why, the answer is he likely got a taste of the anima that was being extracted from those that went to Revendreth. And where I know this must sound like a complete joke coming from the guy who was literally like, oh yeah, the Venthyr and Nathrezim, to now say that the creator of the Venthyr wasn't actually a Venthyr to begin with. Just hear me out. Because something about Revendreth that's rather intriguing, that kind of almost perfectly aligns with the Light's morals and ideals, is the idea of anima extraction. Especially the type of extraction that's occurring in Revendreth. As in, think about it. As in the Light we know of, like the Holy Light, is compassionate, caring, cares for all life, doesn't want to kill anything, etc, etc. The Venthyr quite obviously go out of their way to remove such ideals, yet fundamentally with everything we know about the Shadowlands, that's kind of their choice. As in Denathrius calls it a holy mission, but fundamentally, yes, Revendreth is kind of needed for like penance, but it's penance by whose standards? I mean, you could argue it's the first ones, and it might actually be the first ones, but at the same time, when you look at the Winter Queen, the Primus, and the Archon, they all make sense in relation to their personalities and the way they interact. Denathrius seems to be an incredible outlier in comparison to the others. So, I have to wonder, what if Denathrius invaded Revendreth with this Naaru, or at the very least were in control of this region of the Shadowlands with this Naaru, specifically extracting anima to kind of, well, redeem souls basically. And then over their time, at some point, Denathrius got a taste of anima, like the prideful anima that's being extracted in Revendreth, and in turn betrayed the Naaru that is currently imprisoned within Revendreth. Because something else that doesn't seem to add up in relation to the purpose of Oribus and everything in relation to the Maw being death in the end of everything, is that it's specifically stated that the Naaru want life to exist, as in they don't like things dying. So of all the creatures that aren't present within Revendreth, it's kind of strange that the Naaru don't have some form of presence within the Shadowlands. And or, quite possibly, they might have had a presence within the Shadowlands. Because something else about Denathrius and the idea that the Venthyr are basically vampires, and the whole concept of creatures that are addicted to blood, is that initially you'd assume these creatures are of shadow. Yet we know the Void Elves are quite specifically of shadow. So what in the world are the Sandlane, the Venthyr, the Nathrezim, Denathrius? What are these creatures that are addicted to blood? And once again, with everything I've generally gone over, you could just say, well, they're addicted to a certain type of spirit, so that's why they're vampires. But there are quite obviously other types of, well, vampiric creatures or creatures that hunger for certain types of magic. They're not unique, and yeah, I get that. But what's curious to me is that this idea of being vampiric is quite specifically something related to priests, in particular shadow priests. So with all this in mind, I have to wonder once again, what if this is supposed to kind of be a general indication to Denathrius prior to becoming what he currently is, having a considerably closer connection to the Light than we think, and this monologue possibly just being his way of spitting in the face of the Light, or at least, you know, the way he talks and the way he talks about Revendreth being a way to spit in the face of the Light, but in reality having a lot more truth to it than it actually seems. I mean, not truth in regards to him being a benevolent leader, but more in regards to what the purpose of Revendreth was prior to him coming to power. And yes, this overall theory generally would imply that if Denathrius had some relation to the Light prior to whatever had him come to power, that would mean that A, he was most likely an angel of some sort, and he's kind of playing the role of, well, you could say Lucifer, but it's kind of this idea of being like a fallen angel. And this would also imply that where the Venthyr are technically, or the Venthyr and the Nathrezim that assumedly came from them, are technically Dreadlords, the Lord of Dreadline associated with Denathrius may not actually be as tongue-in-cheek as you'd expect. As in, what if there was a faction of quote-unquote angels or keepers of the Naaru that kind of, well, betrayed the Naaru within the Light? They kind of realized what the Naaru were, what they were doing in relation to hoarding spirit in these massive crystals to become ever benevolent, prideful beings that only believe in like one path. they kind of said no more. Not in relation to being like, oh, let's be better than them, but no, let's just do this for ourselves instead. And so those possible quote-unquote angels became the quote-unquote Lords of Dread. And now possibly they got scattered out, possibly they died, possibly they're the reason why the Prime Naru are all, or most of them are just gone. But somehow Denathrius ends up in the Shadowlands. And I mean, with everything I've said, the possibility of all of the Eternal Ones being something else prior to entering the Shadowlands is quite likely, but also quite possibly unlikely. With Denathrius specifically, it would be he managed to somehow make a bargain to basically get Revendreth. As in, he may have used the Naru that was in his care as a bargaining chip to kind of get Revendreth as his own. And I mean, there is also the possibility that the Light was just invading the Shadowlands, and Denathrius, realizing the power that was in the region, just betrayed the Light in general. As in said, you know what, I'm going to take this power for myself, and basically managed to secure himself Revendreth. Hence why, overall, his character is just completely off in comparison to every other one of the zones, but he still managed to get his own kingdom within the Shadowlands because of his assumed help during the initial Light invasion, which may have left Revendreth scarred, etc, etc. Another notion I should probably mention in relation to this idea that Denathrius is, well, not the first Denathrazim per se, but more like a quote-unquote original Denathrazim / Venthia, etc, etc, is the lore surrounding Ulthalesh. And if you don't know who Ulthalesh is, basically Warlock Legion artifact weapon, the Deadwind Harvester, or its full name, Ulthalesh, the Deadwind Harvester. Ulthalesh was an Denathrazim that refused to bow to Sargeras when he basically called to end the universe when he sundered Mardum and set the demons free. Now what's very weird about Ulthalesh is that he refused Sargeras' call, because okay, in one regard you could say he was either so prideful that he would never bow to Sargeras, or another you could say that he would never call Sargeras master in comparison to the Jailer or Denathrius, etc, etc. But considering how the Denathrazim aren't stupid, and how they were generally designed to cause unrest and cause chaos in general, it's kind of weird that he would stand up to Sargeras, considering it's quite obvious the amount of potential he had in relation to the overall plan Denathrius was seemingly trying to achieve. So what I'm basically saying is that Ulthalesh may have also been a keeper of a Naru who betrayed their Naru, and so in turn would be a quote-unquote true Dreadlord or Lord of Dread. And so the general line of lore here would be that, okay, you have Venthia that got turned into Denathrazim and kind of went around spreading chaos throughout the universe. And the reason they look the way they do and kind of act the way they do is because they are all based off one specific original Lord of Dread. That Lord of Dread being Denathrius. The thing is though, that Denathrius may be their progenitor, he is not the sole existing Lord of Dread. If anything, he is an ex-Lord of Dread as implied by the accuser, as in he kind of either lost his power or he made a deal to ensure that he was safe from possibly the Light. The proof that Denathrius wasn't the only Lord of Dread being Ulthalesh, and his willing defiance of Sargeras. As in, if Ulthalesh did serve a Naru but betrayed that Naru for some semblance of freedom, which also may have been Denathrius' whole goal, in a similar fashion to Illidan, he just basically said he'd rather die. And what is interesting about Ulthalesh is that he's not technically dead. As in, the reason why the Deadwind Harvester has the name Ulthalesh the Deadwind Harvester is because his spirit's still kicking around inside that weapon, and there is a stupid amount of power within that weapon that, if unleashed, well, you could say it has the possibility of releasing a universe worth of angry souls out, but at the very least, if the power is consolidated, you could possibly resurrect Ulthalesh just to find out what he actually was, and if he knew of Denathrius. But yeah, that's it. Afterlives Revendreth. Definitely the shortest animatic, and definitely the animatic that requires a lot more research to find the possible things it relates to, but overall, definitely and arguably the most intriguing animatic out of all of the animatics when it comes to possible speculation. But at the same time, that could just be me being paranoid and just looking into things that aren't really there. But anyway, thank you for watching.